So before I introduce Lisbeth Haas, who's our keynote speaker, I'd like to ask Teresa Salazar and David Farrell to come up and just talk a little bit about, a couple of minutes about the two exhibitions and what they were designed to do.
Thank you. So the exhibition I'm going to talk about is the one that's in the main gallery. It's Bancroft to the core, and actually Lisbeth asked me, is it the core? And yes, it is the core. So what it is the original material that Hubert Howe Bancroft collected. And so what we try to do that in that exhibit is show, again, his sort of enterprise as a book collector. He did trips to the East Coast and also to Europe to collect books. He got a lot of dealers to help him, especially with the auctions. And again, from those auctions, a lot of the Mexican and Central American material were gathered from the Andrade, Ramirez, and Squire auctions in Europe in the 19th century. The other thing we try to show is how, one man could not collect all that material. And so we tried to focus on the field collectors as well, because they were crucial. So that included his wife, Matilda Bancroft, some not so trustworthy people like Ivan Petrov, but also some wonderful people like Thomas Savage, the very emotional Enrique Cerruti, and what we call the sort of field collector extraordinaire, Alphonse Pinard, who went all over the place. I don't know how he did it, but he certainly covered the globe. So that's the focus of the exhibit in the main gallery. Unfortunately, it's closed today, but we hope people who are around on Monday can go and view that exhibit. But David's is on view, so turn it over to him.
Thank you. Well, our exhibit is in the roll cases, which are 6 cases in the hallway outside the corridor between the Bancroft Library and Doe Library, the Doe entrance to the Bancroft Library. And the roll cases are dedicated to materials from the archives. They were donated by an archivist in honor of the first university archivist, Charles Roll, Joseph Roll. And what we intended to do was sort of give an introduction, and I should say my co-curators were Catherine Neal, the Associate University Archivist, and Michelle Morgan, an archivist in the technical services. And our intention was, when we heard that Jack and Teresa were going to do this, we said, well, we'd like to do something in the roll cases that would sort of frame or introduce your exhibit. So they were focusing on the treasures of the Bancroft collection, the Bancroft collection collected by Bancroft himself. What we wanted to do was step back and give the viewers of the gallery exhibition an introduction to Bancroft, a fascinating figure, an introduction to himself, to who he was, where he came from, what motivated him. We drew heavily on his autobiography, Literary Industries, and we kind of like that phrase that I guess he coined, literary industries, so we called him a literary industrialist, which I think is a good way to think of him. And so we talk about his early childhood in Ohio, how he came with great intrepidness to California and survived and thrived amazingly. We talked a little bit about California. We have some early scenes of San Francisco and Sacramento at the time that he saw them, drawing on our pictorial collections. We also then talked about how he began collecting this library and the buildings that it was in. So one of the things we talk about is the very interesting and diverse locations that the library has been in San Francisco in 2 or 3 locations, and then coming to campus, it was in Cal Hall, it was in 2 or 3 locations in Doe Library. It moved into the to the Doe Library Annex in 1950. It had a renovation in 1970. It moved out to the town for 3 years while we were doing our spectacular total renovation, and then reopened here. So we talk about the various locations. We have some cute little floor plans and scenes of inside the libraries of those days. And then we end up with kind of the grand finale is what the Bancroft Library is today, which is much bigger and more spectacular than even Bancroft's library or even than Bancroft or the early people at Cal who brought the library here could have envisioned. So we talk about how beginning with the core library of Bancroft to what the Bancroft Library is with its 7 additional programs, which make it really a very spectacular resource. So that's what we were intending to do to support Jack and Teresa.
Actually, I'm going to have one more thing. So I did forget to mention my collaborator. So Jack Von Oy is the curator of our pictorial collection, and he helped with that exhibit, as well as Dylan Essen, who's a PhD candidate in the history department, and it truly was a collaboration. All three of us worked very hard to bring this all together. Thank you.
And I think they finished about 2 o'clock yesterday afternoon, so just in time. It's my very great pleasure to introduce our keynote speaker this morning, Professor Lisbeth Haas from University of California at Santa Cruz. Thursday there was a day of action, and where faculty and students from all sectors of the higher education system in California went up to Sacramento to try to convince the state legislatures that they really need to fund the university. And Professor Haas is a perfect example of why that is important. She is a product of the University of California system. She was born in Virginia, but she moved here. She moved to California in 1964. She got her BA at the University of California at San Diego. She got her PhD at the University of California at Irvine, and she, of course, is now teaching at UC Santa Cruz. This is what the university does. We teach the teachers. And so if any of you have any clout with your state legislatures, go back and tell them to do good. Professor Haas has focused on the history of California. She teaches very broadly, but her primary interest has been on the history of California. She has won the Organization of American Historians Elliott Rudwick Prize for Conquest and Historical Identities in California, 1769 to 1936. She has a very long series of articles on a broad variety of subjects in California history. I'm not going to go into them. She's got two books that will be published by UC Press. They are in different stages of completion, but it indicates, I think, some of the range of her work. One is called Horses and Saints, Indigenous Histories and the Missions of Colonial and Mexican California and Writing. And then the second one is, I've got the titles wrong. Okay. Horses and Saints, Indigenous Histories of California, Missions in Mexican California, 1750 to 1850, and the writing of Luiseño scholar Pablo Tac, 1821-1840. In other words, a California mission Indian who was, in fact, a scholar. She teaches in Santa Cruz. She lives in San Francisco in the Haight-Ashbury, though, which is another California experience. And I'm not going to say any more. Liz is going to be talking to us today about multi-ethnic California that lives quietly in the archives. Beth.
Well, thank you, Charles, and everyone for the invitation and for you being here. I appreciate that. I love talking about the Bancroft because I feel like it's been my archive since I was a young scholar. And so I'm honored to be able to speak here today. The title, California, a multi-ethnic place that lives quietly in the archives, is meant to be more of an image that conjures up the allure of the archives, discoveries that can be made, and places we conjure up in our minds after reading the documents. But there is, of course, no real California living in the archives on its own, and the documents don't speak for themselves in any easy way. So what I'm interested in is two types of things, the type of knowledge that the documents do establish in the Bancroft. What kind of knowledge do they establish? Because they're not just telling us facts. And what historical imaginations do those documents reflect? Now, the Bancroft, I was early drawn to it, as were many in my generation, because of the rich body of materials about early California, especially the Chicano-Mexican communities that had suffered tremendous losses in property, place, culture, and politics after 1848. And the Bancroft Library has a core of those materials from the deliberate and somewhat controversial decisions made by many Californios to give their testimonials, a form of autobiography and history, to assistants of the Bancroft during the 1870s. And they also gave their many documents from the Spanish and Mexican periods and from the early American period to Bancroft to put in his library. Now, why? Well, this was a vast collecting that went on during the 1870s, partly due to the friendship of Hubert Howe Bancroft with Guadalupe Mariano Viejo, or General Mariano Guadalupe Vallejo, who's got a picture over there, Vallejo, you know, Vallejo, a lot of people say. So Vallejo is, you'll see him in the, maybe you don't see Vallejo, but I think you see Vallejo in the exhibit, in the core exhibit. You'll see some of the people I'm talking about. He was a one-time Mexican general in California and a large landowner with extraordinary wealth, power, and stature in the San Francisco Bay Area up through Sonoma. Bancroft thought Vallejo, quote, must possess a great many state documents, official correspondence, and mission and presidio papers indispensable to a history of the period, which is what he intended to write and did write, Bancroft. But Vallejo also did write his own history. He did have those documents and had begun to write a history earlier than Bancroft, the 1874, when Bancroft contacted him finally and won his approval. Vallejo wrote his history began in 1867 of Mexican and Spanish California. That history unfortunately burned along with some other things in Vallejo's house. So Vallejo, who had initially refused to work with Bancroft, by 1874, Vallejo had been despoiled of his lands and lost his wealth, and lived on but a small lot of his house that was also fully mortgaged. At that point, Enrique Cerruti, became convinced Vallejo, or somehow Vallejo became convinced that he could trust Bancroft to generate, store, and incorporate the documents of Vallejo and other Californios into the history of California. So Vallejo became a spokesperson and an enthusiast for Bancroft's library. And during the mid-1870s, Vallejo traveled up and down the coast, sometimes with Bancroft's assistant Cerruti, sometimes alone, convincing people to donate their personal archives and state and family papers, maps, and photos to Bancroft. He also convinced many to dictate their histories to Bancroft's assistants, Henry Cerruti and Tomas Savage. This process constituted an important moment of historical reclamation for Californios. They consulted their documents. They told and collaborated on stories. They created versions of their past and gathered materials for the library. Many people in California communities participated in the project in order to leave records in which their actions and beliefs stood at the center of this archival collection. For a number of years during the 1870s, Cerruti and Savage took some 60 or more interviews of Californios and a few of indigenous people and gathered those documents. Some insisted on writing their own histories, and Vallejo dictated and also wrote a 5-volume California history with Cerruti, Bancroft's assistant, and alternately wrote in the company of old friends he visited in Monterey, in Santa Barbara, and Los Angeles. And in contrast to others who wrote their histories or spoke their histories, the majority, to Bancroft's assistants, Vallejo tenaciously insisted upon his own voice. And as Genaro Padilla has made very clear, he edited his own text and added to it when he desired. He also gave all of his Presidio, Mission, and Mexican state papers to Bancroft. Now, despite the careful preservation of his authorial voice, Vallejo still gave his book and Presidio, Mission, and Government papers to Bancroft. Why? He did so even despite suggestions he received from many to find another publisher. Writing to San Francisco's La Voz del Nuevo Mundo, the Spanish language paper, in the 1870s, Vallejo justified his decision to trust Bancroft with the archive and history because, he said, Bancroft's work will have a much better reception than mine. Yet Bancroft never published Vallejo's history, nor has anyone since, although Rosemary Beebe wants to publish it now. So it's still in the Bancroft Library. Now, the manuscript collection process produced controversy among Californios, and Vallejo himself was bitterly disappointed, he said, when Bancroft's 7-volume History of California relied heavily on his own, but in some ways seemed to appropriate it and yet change the meaning, not to reflect the kind of meanings that Vallejo had conveyed, the personages, the front pieces, the main characters. He was discouraged, he was disappointed, but at the same time, he had turned over everything. That's how much he felt he was on the losing end and just simply needed a record, an archive to store his knowledge and to store the facts he wanted down, along with his friends. And so, despite his disappointment, Vallejo's 2 sons also donated their histories of California to the library. But the origins of the archives, this origins, which is so interesting to me, seem to have influenced the continuing collection of local popular histories in the Bancroft, despite the collection of many other things as well. But histories that relate to the oral, to the vernacular with Twain, to stories about agriculture, agricultural workers, immigrants with the Manuel Gamio and Paul Taylor collections, stories on the 1920s, 30s, and 40s that very much fall in line with people telling their story and having a radical sense and anxiety to get these things recorded. The allure of the archive for them was great. Now, given California's concerns with their own representation, I was initially surprised with the kind of representations of indigenous society that I found in the very documents that they donated. This was when I was working on my turn to my second or third book. It was called, because out of it came 2, it was called Houses and, it's called Horses and Saints, Indigenous Histories of Colonial Missions and Mexican California, as nice introduction said. So I shouldn't have been surprised, though, at these were, after all, colonial archives. And there has been tremendous debate about the ethics and the production of knowledge in colonial archives. The historical realities of colonialism itself that put people above and below each other, the tremendous hierarchies of knowledge, for that matter, informed the kind of knowledge gathering that people did and produced documents from their own questions that became hard facts. Facts such as, oh, those people are neophytos, neophytes. And you read about neophytes throughout the documents. Now, what does that mean? Well, it just means a new convert, someone new to the faith. But it doesn't tell you, and let me turn this on now, it doesn't tell you about the ethnic histories of those people. It doesn't, in fact, give you any history of those people. Unfortunately, most priests, when they got the chance, said in 1814, these people have no history, and they have no important people. I'm sorry, you know, they're sorry to say it, but they say this is a live conquest. This is not yet a group of tributary Indians where we can promise the crown money from or just turn the land back over to. This is a live conquest. Now, so the allure, California lives quietly in the archives. What they then didn't give us was a sense, these colonial documents often leave out altogether the mapping. This is southern San Francisco Bay and the different indigenous villages that Randall Milligan has brought together in his book, A Time of Little Choice, which I think is a very good way to put it, A Time of Little Choice. And he shows how people from these villages slowly but surely went into San Francisco Mission and then Santa Clara Mission, ultimately Santa Cruz, San Jose, the missions around the San Francisco Bay. So we lose this geography altogether. In fact, we would never know it existed except people recently, archaeologists, began to reconstruct it from other documents. We can construct it, though, because the priest did, as many of you must know, in the baptismal records that are now, thanks to Stephen Hackle, online, and a big project at the Huntington. So they're called the population statistics of early California, or something like that. They are simply drawing from baptismal records that did at least mention the place where people came from. Now, in Mexico, many of those places might have been re-inhabited or even continued to be inhabited, and they would have been brought in and remembered as Mexicans' towns. Not here, because so much of that land, of those lands, was simply encompassed by these huge missions. And 50 years into it, they're still incorporating lands and people. Now, these are called Habitants de California. They're done by Choris, a French explorer. And so he's telling us something that many of the documents don't. He's telling us about that people were tattooed, that they brought in certain ethnicities. And he'll tell us, he won't tell us, in fact, but other documents will, that tattoos have meaning. His own writing says the California Indians where he was had ugly, plain faces. Now, I'm sorry, I have to doubt that those are actually the faces he saw even, because people, if you get more into these archives, I don't believe that some of what he represents he saw, but you have to question, where did he get his physical features? Where did he get his eyes to see a population that he knew so little about, that he didn't know their language? How could he get inside of that? Here again, some of his men drew the Presidio of San Francisco, and he reminds us of the many contracts that the Presidios and towns made with Indian people, and brought them in from the villages, and brought them right into the missions to work for the missions. And again, that's very hard to find. You can enumerate those as statistics in the archives, but what did it mean to those villages far out in the San Joaquin Valley or in the mountains when they got these goods? And this is another classic piece by Perus, an earlier piece. Here he has, his imaginary is to give us sort of Roman soldiers at the mission, standing in line. And all of these images, by the way, are at the Bancroft, and I certainly appreciate them. I'm just saying and they're in paintings, they're quite beautiful, but they are imaginaries as well. He conveys that, of course, he conveys something different in his writing, and you can try that, but in his visual image, he conveys the sense that these men could have dressed in togas, and there is one child. They are Roman citizens. They are being brought into a citizenry. They are being brought into a democracy of sorts. Not unfamiliar. They are in a fabulous setting of houses, of huts. They like the order. They did complain about these huts, and Indian people insisted on them so they could burn them down every year and clean them and build them back up. So that's how the priests definitely wanted to build adobes, and in many of the missions they built many, many adobes, and some just a few, and the Indian elite went into the adobes. But the reason why Indian people like the huts is to burn them and keep them clean, they felt. So and this is by Langsdorff, I think. No, this is still by Choris. So he is giving us a sense also of the production that goes on at the mission that you rarely hear about unless an anthropologist gets in there and does some digging. They might find quills. Mainly they'll find the beads that continued to be produced in the missions long after the people were missionized, let's say 3 generations in. They're still producing beads and feathers and buying beads and feathers so that they can dance at the mission. And if you want to know some of the knowledge, some of the scholarship, some of the ancient histories, goes into that kind of production of procuring and getting those quills, the feathers. It's amazing. They're not just from the San Francisco Bay Area. They're still coming down trade routes, coming into trade routes. And the knowledge, again, that goes into dance is really tremendous. It's dance we learn from Indian writers only, and then you can talk about it from other non-Western traditions. Dance allows knowledge, the body to speak, allows knowledge to come into the body. It allows the body to generate knowledge, is the idea. Now, we're talking about the archival dilemma of having pictures that speak one thing, of having writing that speaks another, but having very little self-explanation by Indians. So I went then, followed one Indian writer who had gone to Rome, this is really Bologna, to another archive, to get outside altogether of an archival dilemma. Now, this is really Bologna, but imagine this beautiful archive, just to take you into the allure of archives. This archive was made in Bologna from I again followed an American Indian's work into this archive. And I'm not going to so much talk about that work, I've talked about it before, and it'll come out in a book, but I just want to talk about the archival part of it. To get into this archive and find his work there was to find an American Indian who was truly international, who could truly give us a sense. He studied at the College of the Propaganda of the Faith in Rome. He left, his name was Pablo Tac, and he left San Luis Rey at the age of about 11, 1831. He left and went to Mexico City for a couple of years, and I would love to have filmed. That's another part of the story, what happened in Mexico City, where Indians had historically always been educated, now the Indian elite once again, and had left documents. So that was no oddity to him. And then he went finally to Rome, where he continued 4 years of study of Latin, he studied philosophy, he studied rhetoric, and he studied history. As he studied, he wrote. He produced a manuscript. And the manuscript he produced for a linguist. And it was a linguist who got children, kids, young men, really, from all over the world to come to Rome and write. Write out. As they became priests, they left their stories. Now, the only story that there is no story that compares to the Pablo Tac story. I looked through the whole archive, been there a number of times, and Pablo Tac not only gives a grammar, but he gives a dictionary, partial English, Luiseño, Spanish grammar and dictionary. And a little bit of it is written in Latin. And then he writes a history in Spanish. So this is what the beautiful library, the beautiful archive looked like. And again, Bologna is very important in that it was a big, very communal spirit during the Middle Ages all the way into the 19th century. So it's not odd that it would have this international also scholarship in its archives. Now, as you can see, in the archive, you can actually touch it. No one wears white gloves. They don't believe in it. You have, of course, there's no guards, but there are archivists right there, and you're on beautiful long tables with everything you need, right on that table. And you get the manuscript, and you might get them all piled in a cart, and then you can pull it out and, as I say, touch it, which is almost like, if you've worked in many American archives and you have to have gloves, the first day you kind of want to faint, you just can't believe it. And it's a beautiful archive. Now, I'm bringing up, again, one of those visions that we can see at the Bancroft, and that's of dance at San Jose in 1806. But the problem is, and we can get a story written about that too, but the problem is they don't talk about dance the way Pablo Tac talks about dance. So it's not that one or the other has to be better. But they certainly both need to be part of the story, I think. And this is Pablo Tac's beautiful writing. So again, I don't want to talk about Tac. He wasn't part of our archive. But in terms of knowledge and what is recorded, I think he's very important because, again, Nicholas Dirks reminds us that in certain important ways, knowledge is what colonialism was all about, producing the kind of knowledge that allowed for rule, so that you can only get some kinds of knowledge in a colonial archive. That's why you definitely want to go beyond it. But I guess one of the other ways that I step out of it is to tell colonial stories from multiple frameworks. I wonder, just as yesterday, Louis made reference to, Lewis Warren made reference to the multiple stories of the ghost dance. He didn't tell one, and he ultimately said, the story of the religious, of the unknown, of the unseeable, of the spiritual, is as good, perhaps, as the story of the weather and the economy and things you can otherwise measure. So at least he left that question open. He gave us multiple stories in some sense, multiple ways of approaching this. And it certainly was anything but a colonial story. And many people will say, as having to do with Indian people, the colonial stories persist up to this day, into the 21st century. But so multiple stories, in this case, I want to make around the Chumash revolt that happened in 1824 and that many of you might have read about or know something about. So we get back to a mapping here of what is Chumash territory. Now you can see this whole inner area is the Central Valley, and people in this area and through the desert area were not able to, the lines were cut off. The military couldn't go through, that wasn't their area. It's sort of the area like Brian DeLay spoke of, except that this was not an area of the northern frontier that was colonized. In fact, settlers had not even been able to colonize it. They had been able to, Yokuts and Miwok people from the Central Valley had been able, some had gone into the mission, made alliances with the coastal mission, and then taken the horses back. So by 1816, one priest called it a republic of hell and a diabolical union. That's what that geography represented to him. It was an Apacheria. It was a group, it was a land where the Apaches lived, where the wild Indians, the autonomous Indians stayed. And I want to tell one story from that era to give a sense of it. Horses. In 1819, Chief Tisac of Tache, and now, of course, I'm using the sources from the Bancroft and from other archives. Tisac from Tache, one of those villages in the Central Valley, he came into he arrived at Mission Soledad on horseback with a Christian Indian, Jose Maria, 3 mountain assistants, and 12 men on foot. They were armed but did not intend to fight. Rather, they rode horses and carried arms, the priest said, in order, quote, to make themselves respectable. And for protection, as missionary Payedes later said to the governor, Chief Tisac went to Soledad in order to negotiate the status of fugitives from the mission who took refuge in his village and in other nearby villages. He sought to avoid Spanish aggression against his village, which would inevitably occur. The Spanish would move in there with the armies. They might take people prisoner. They might even bring them back as time went on. This had escalated the violence. It didn't begin like that. A year earlier, 47 people had escaped from Mission Soledad. About half were from Chief Tisac's village, and another quarter were from a neighboring village. He and the missionary arrived at an agreement, the terms of which weren't laid out in the colonial record. Payedes sent the accord and gifts to the brother of Chief Tisac and tried to keep Tisac and his men there. But during the night, they escaped undetected. So that they could arrive in horseback in 1819 suggests that the chief purpose of the missions not to let people ride on horseback, not to let Native societies gain their own autonomous power, that chief project had fallen by the roadside. Fugitives like Christian Indian Jose Maria, who traveled with Tisac's party, were often able to translate for people. They were able to teach them Indian husbandry. They could teach them how to fight in Spanish ways, and they could teach them how to plant. So people had no trouble using the tools they could of the Spanish. In mountainous villages, we can't even imagine in this terrain, but you know, the missions are all along here, and the missions that we're talking about are a little farther up here. Most of these missions from Santa Barbara, Santa Monica, there are 6 missions in here. I didn't want to put them there as the only stagnant space because they came and they went, and they weren't alone. So that was Yokut's territory. So in 1824, when a revolt happened, Fray Juan Cabot sent this announcement to the governor. Those whom I sent to Tache to warn the heathen Indians not to join with the rebels have returned from their mission. They say that the Purisima Indians sent 2 sacks of beads to persuade all the villages to join them in annihilating the soldiers. However, Tache and Talome refused to receive anything, those villages. The Nontontos took the presents but did not go. On the other hand, the people from Bubal and San Tache not only took the presents, but a week before last, February 21st, the day of the revolt, some of them from each village started out for La Purísima. So it was a revolt that was highly organized in advance, or at least organized in advance. They kept organizing. They brought, as we're going to see, the revolt happened at Mission Santa Ynez, but it had been organized. Now, why people still believe usually that the revolt happened because a priest beat an Indian and they had just had it. And that's what usually people say. It comes from one native document that was found in the AGN. One priest document found in the AGN. But really, we can see from these documents, it had been organized. It began at Santa Ynez on March 21st, 1824, and involved 554 Christians, all from that mission. 19 Iniseños died in the insurrection and subsequent exile from the mission. They burned the mission. 4 men died in that fire, while women and children died during the skirmishes and subsequent exile that took place for a total of 4 months. And La Purísima, they went there. So 14 boys died, 11 women, 4 girls, only 1 soldier. Now, at Mission La Purísima, they also took up arms, 722 Christian Indians, so that we have over 1,200 people fighting at that point in one way or another. They gained control of Mission firearms, and the first evening, they kept the soldiers there, the first 2 evenings, and the wives, and they took all the clothes that represented the status of Spaniards and of soldiers. And because clothing was very important to keep you in your place, and Indian people could usually only wear certain things like loincloths and a certain outfit they had. But so they took the soldiers' clothing and donned it. The soldiers never got it back, so that's in the military archives. But they donned the clothing, they paraded around, they danced with it. They did taunt people with it because they had lived this life where actually this is a mission in decline. They had seen so many of their forefathers die there. So there was tremendous anger, and they did what you can never do as a colony. They killed 4 white men who were passing, 4 Californios. And they kept the mission all on their own for 3 months. They ran everything. And then the mission was taken over again. But in the meantime, the next day, Santa Barbara went up in fire. Or went up, not in fire, but in revolt. The women, this is over 1,000 women, children, and some of the men fled in the early morning hours because the Presidio was right next door. Others stayed to fight the soldiers. And this is kind of what I want to point to you that we've got 1,000 or more people going into exile. How did that happen? It wasn't just a spontaneous event, of course. Andres Sigamomatesi, and that's a Chumash word that I'm not pronouncing correctly, was an alcalde at Mission Santa Barbara, but he was a cimarrone. He had run away from the mission. And like many people in this story, they were aided by cimarrones. Many of those villages now outside the mission in the San Joaquin Valley and in the mountains had taken in runaways from the mission, or had people who went into the missions and then ran home again. And, you know, again, it's a difficult place to be, and yes, you run home. And they were willing then, they were the first guards who went out there and began to get them on, get people by gifting often, and by relatives, get them involved. So there were three of these, and three of these guards who went out, and two of them lived right around Buena Vista Lake, which is right there, that little lake right there. So it was a 5-day walk from Santa Barbara through the mountains to get to that lake, and a little easier to go here from La Purísima and San Inés to go to that lake. But in all cases, it was a 3 to 5 day walk. And I think most went via the Santa Barbara route because that was easier. They had meetings with people in the mountains. They slaughtered the cattle they brought from the missions. They divided up the meat. And they, in the meantime, were given housing. They were given housing right around Buena Vista Lake because of the connections some people had made, and just because of the general solidarity, they were given housing by even people as far over here and over here. They mentioned imagine there are over 1,000 people, and these villages are used to sustaining 250. So it wasn't easy. People had to be divided up, and their supplies would run out as they did. It was a 4-month revolt. Now, there's a lot to say about it, but there's a lot we don't know. And that silence is interesting. The silence is interesting because the missionaries talked about their fears about everybody in that desert land and in these mountains, everybody in this non-colonial space here would rise up against them. But their fears, well, let me say this, that was their fears, that's how they recorded, and in some sense that allowed for violence. Whereas the military just treated it like, they said, in the first official report to the Mexican government, they, after 3 months, military Governor Arguello simply provided a sketch of the facts. They revolted, killed various individuals, and destroyed and reduced to ashes Mission Santa Inés with all its furniture, provisions, and goods. Arguello said, that's fairly inevitable. He said, look, there's not more than 3,000 souls here, and I'm not sure if he's right, but he means settlers, and there's 22,000 of them. The troops, he argued, were in constant campaign in order to secure their well-being. And the priest, likewise, said nothing about what happened. Father Rodriguez stayed with people at Mission La Purísima the whole month that they occupied the mission, or almost month they occupied it. He never wrote a word that we can find. And Ripoll, who had been there and then went with the soldiers and their families over to Santa Inés, and he had innumerable accounts of the daily trying to organize peace, but never said why they revolted. All he said was like what Saria said, look, the law protects them from this, and Saria was the head of the missions. He said, they should be saved, this is inevitable. He reminded the governor that the law anticipated the rebellion of those who the Spanish had conquered and reduced. That was their words. Time and again he wrote for leniency, even as he expressed his fear of a massive attack on the coast and that they would all die. He was trying to give paternal aid and protect them. And in fact, he was one of the priests who they trusted enough to take the pardon that the government did give and went out with that. Now I just want to add another part of this story. The revolt ends in 4 months. They have aid. They go back to their missions. What does that show us? It's not possible just to flee. All of this countryside that looks so empty is taken up. There are Indians all over there, and they're outside the control of the Spanish Empire. They're outside of Mexican society. And they are gaining every day more power through trade, increasing amounts of trade, and through firearms. Now, ultimately, in the 1830s, that increase of trade will lead to their demise, just in terms of demographics. But some survive, certainly. But what I just want to get at here is 2 other things. The Ingenieros were all saying something like this: if they shoot at me, water will come out of the cannon. Another would say, if they shoot at me, the bullets will not enter my flesh. That's what Maria Solares said. That was the community-received wisdom of the revolt in 1914. Her father had been involved in it as a child. Native accounts suggest the revolt had the characteristics of a revitalization movement in which a prophecy existed that they could rectify their condition and act without suffering retaliation. They speak to the power invested in the things that Native elite had, such as an atswan that is around the neck of human hair, and if a soldier's bullet hits you, you will not die if you have that atswan on. So they told stories of a soldier who got hit by the bullet, and finally the soldiers realized, oh, he's got on an atswan, and he pulled it off, he died. And other men who had supernatural power, who came over to help the San Inseños and killed a soldier on his way, jumped on a horse, put on the soldier's clothes, and rode over. And then another soldier said to him, Kota, hey, you've got a soldier's outfit on, get off that horse, because he was getting a fresh horse. And he said, try and get me. And he looked at him, hopped on the horse, and disappeared, and jumped on top of the mountain, and from the top of the mountain laughed back, ha, try to get me from here. So that's the power of their leaders. And the whole time, all their stories, at least 2 of the 3, they focus on this kind of power that Indian people had, and no longer had, but had then, and that made their leaders powerful, and that made them a community. Now, the third story, type of story, is that told, and here we're getting back to Guadalupe Vallejo and his 5 volumes of history that Bancroft didn't use that much. For Vallejo, the whole revolt occurred because there was a leader, and this is a nationalist story, a male leader carrying people through to freedom. And that male leader he called Pacomio, and it was definitely one of the men who was accused of killing one of the first 4 Californios who were killed, and he then lived in Monterey as part of his sentence to exile from Santa Barbara to Monterey. But anyway, Vallejo said it was because of Pacomio. Pacomio, on the one hand, was an extraordinarily intelligent young man who could have gone to Europe, many said, because he had learned to be a carpenter and a plasterer. He could have gone to Europe and been treated like other people, other citizens, and he could have been fine and gotten out of this colonial dilemma. But the apparent rift was so strong, and Pacomio such a good man, that he had a work of revenge to accomplish. And so this is just the nature of the story. Pacomio stayed there, and he led the Indians into this revolt. So you see that version of history where the great leader leads the mass, versus what happened where the whole populations are up in arms, and it lasted 4 months. And they've got interethnic allies to support them. So with that said, I think colonial histories, and you can tell me what you think, but if you get a chance, but I think colonial histories are best told with these different archives that bring in different historical imaginaries and different facts, because the facts of that era are all of these facts. And so let me just end then with 2 other Berkeley depictions. And this is the fact of the border. Well, anyway, there's the border. I think there's 12 obelisks, maybe 18 along the border, that are like this, made after 1848. And what is the gate at that point, the fence, doing? It's protecting the monument. there's no border per se, except on paper. And this is Tijuana, which actually figures a big part in the indigenous histories of colonial San Diego. So the Bancroft has so many beautiful charms, some of which I drew that Chumash story from. There's over 3 million pictures of California alone, so the pictorial collection cannot be underestimated, and so many new ways of seeing these images that I think we have centuries more of work to do, or hundreds of more years of work to do here. That's it. Thank you.
Thank you very much. We do have a few minutes for some questions if you'd like to ask them sometime. Maybe we'd like to bring up things that we're talking about yesterday. Everybody keep it watching. Over there.
Yeah, thank you so much for this wonderful talk. I have a question about, if we're going to take a post-colonial perspective on this, which I think really is very much needed in the field, yeah, sure. The case of Pablo Tac is fascinating, of course. And one dimension that maybe you could speak to a little bit is he learns the language, or the languages being Spanish and Latin, of the oppressors, as it were, but at the same time of his, it's more than just a question of simple oppression models and all that. So what do we do with learning the language of the colonial powers and the imperial powers that then are, also part of the demise of the culture?
Yeah, very good point. From what I've seen, it's often, at least in Chumash territory, the wealthiest, most educated and powerful people who learn Spanish, because then they are able to bring into their language Spanish on their own terms to the extent they can. They make the translations. They do it with the priest, but they're the only ones who know the language, as is in all these cases. The priest might learn some Nahuatl, no Otomi. They're supposed to, and you can see that in some of their writing about Indian people here. But anyway, it's really to know that language is like today. It's a currency. It's the translation, the power of the translator, the power of the negotiator. It's really to step out of the colonial frame and just be acted against, and to be able to give language and give words meaning in 2 or 3 different languages and concepts, and to subvert concepts better in some way, if you look at it that way.